This is another RARA podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Now, AASA is one of the most significant organisations, one of the most impactful international organisations focused on animal studies. I encourage you all to join. It's a mere $60 Australian if you're a waged academic, but they also have a concession rate of $15 Australian. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. Now, since last time I recorded an episode, they have announced a new title in the series, and that's Australian Animal Law by Elizabeth Ellis, which will be released in July 2022. So that's something to look out for, especially if you're coming from an Australian perspective or an animal law perspective, which I know many of you do. Now, I was recently in touch with our friends at Lantern Books in the United States, and they said, as I was talking to them about a different book, that I just had to take a look at their 2022 collection, Vegan Entanglements, Dismantling Racial and Carceral Capitalism. And I'm very pleased to say that today I'm speaking to the editor of that book, Zane McNeill. Although as I say that, I feel I should apologise for my British accent, as I'm sure it's actually Zane McNeill. Either way, Zane is an independent scholar and activist. They have an academic background in history and political science and will soon be starting law school. As well as being the editor of Vegan Entanglements, they are the co-editor of Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression, which was published by Sanctuary Publishers in 2020, and the editor of Y'all Means All, The Emerging Voices Queering Appalachia, which was published by PM Press in 2022. Zane is also the co-manager of RARA, and that's Rights for Animal Rights Advocates, which is a labour organisation, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Welcome to the podcast, Zane.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here.
So can you start by telling us a bit about what led to this collection, Vegan Entanglements?
Yeah, so in 2020 in the United States was a very tumultuous and scary and exciting time after the murder of George Floyd. And for the first time, animal welfare organizations were asking themselves, whether, not only what they should say about the Black Lives Matter movement, but whether or not they even should. And so at this time, I was working for an organization called the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and that was something we were having a lot of internal conversations and dialogue about. And in addition to sort of that space, I was also in contact with a lot of activists and academics thinking through abolition and what that would look like, and especially with nonprofits, usually mostly using single-issue veganism sort of tactics that ended up being very carceral in a lot of ways. And so I had worked with my one friend, William Horn, who was part of the Activist History Review, and we were able to have a roundtable. And we invited Lori Gruen, who's this philosopher, and Justin Marceau, who's an animal attorney, and Lee Kurtz, who is a journalist who was in my first collection to think through anti-carceral veganism. And from that conversation, I really wanted to collect their voices and other voices and think through how to move forward to these kind of abolitionist vegan futures.
So I think this is one of those books that will have some listeners nodding along furiously and some listeners just a bit stumped. I'd like to kind of start with the basics. You're talking about carcerality and you're talking about anti-carceral veganism, and the thing you're aiming to challenge here is carceral veganism. So what is carceral veganism?
So the way and every author kind of operationalizes it differently, but the kind of working definition we have is that it's a sort of veganism or vegan politics that relies on the state to protect animals through forms of prosecution. And so that includes in the United States, working with ICE and the immigration industrial complex, working with the prison industrial complex, all within a sort of entanglement of capitalism that sees normalized violence in factory farms as sort of a non-issue and instead focuses on prosecuting individual workers or people in meatpacking plants. And so that was kind of where we were coming from. Every author, especially on their geographic area, sort of understands it differently. But the main idea is that it's a form of vegan politics that relies on sort of seeing the other as someone worthy of being prosecuted against.
So, what's the alternative to carceral veganism?
So most of the authors in our collection, especially in the U.S., are saying there's no reason to have prisons, right? That the idea of there being an individual at a factory farm that might have been uncovered with undercover video and then prosecuted as sort of a bad apple, and then ended up being either deported or incarcerated for animal cruelty, that doesn't actually help animals, right? And just like Angela Davis says, the idea of the prison, both as a physical space and as a logic of criminalizing the other, really doesn't do anything for anyone, other than harming Black people. It's a really specific form of anti-Black racism in the United States. And so the work that these contributors do are saying, these calling out these organizations like ALDF that have gotten funding through carceral discourse like Harm an Animal, Go to Jail, HSUS and ASPCA that work with criminal justice systems and go after workers. There's a few different legal cases where they prosecuted individuals, workers, and led to felony charges. And we're very proud of that until recently. And it's been really this change in this conversation since 2020. And this book is trying to ride off that kind of excitement of maybe the systems are changing, maybe the vegan organizations are recognizing that whether or not they wanted to, they were doing harm, and what it could look like to do something different. And so what the authors in this really talk about, are sanctuary politics, the idea of creating safe spaces for workers, building coalition and collaborative advocacy movements with worker justice movements, and really trying to fight the main structures of racial capitalism together. And that's the only way to really, for many of these authors, it's the only way they see as being able to fight for animal and human liberation.
That's really interesting. And there's so much to pick up on there. And I want to ask you a bit about race in a few seconds, because that's, of course, such an important part of this conversation. But I'm intrigued by this idea of opposition to state involvement in the prosecution of animal cruelty cases or animal abuse. I absolutely understand and empathise with the idea that animal organisations working with the state to target workers, that just plays into the hands of animal agribusiness, right? Because they can then say, oh, well, it's a few bad apples. There's nothing wrong with us. There's something wrong with these few workers who you filmed abusing animals or mistreating animals in some way. So I understand that. But then I'm wondering, are you suggesting, or are the contributors to this collection suggesting, or is this anti-carceral logic suggesting that the state shouldn't be involved in protecting animals using the police, using prisons, using these kinds of coercive tools?
Yeah, that's exactly what most of us are saying. I think a lot of us are coming from leftist perspectives and anarchist perspectives that are very much recognize the state apparatus as itself a form of violence, right? And entangled with speciesism and really behind the cause or entangled with the causes that lead to the violence against animals and workers, and see the police and other agencies as sort of an arm of the state. And so we are really saying that to create a world that is abolitionist, that is based on total liberation, that dismantles speciesism, you have to dismantle the state, and especially the carceral logic of the state and the capitalist system that the state upholds and works within.
Yes, I see. Now, I'll lay my cards on the table because I come from a different kind of political perspective here, insofar as I identify quite openly with liberalism. So I'm not an anarchist. And I'm always left wondering, with these kinds of anarchist visions, what do we do about animal abuse? Is the belief that once these systems have been dismantled, there won't be abuse of animals? Or is there some other route to dealing with the problem of animal abuse insofar as it continues to remain in an anarchist future?
So in the first collection that I did with Julia Feliz, who is a person behind Sanctuary Publishers and just a really amazing trans Black, Indigenous scholar who's been really ignored by animal studies in a lot of spaces because of the really transformative things that they've been saying and not offered a platform in the same way that I am now, right? Partially because I'm white. But we came up with this term of like cis heteropatriarchal speciesism, which is a big mouthful. But the idea is that the systems of dominance that end up alienating and commodifying and exploiting animals are entangled with the same logics that lead to the marginalization and oppression of queer and trans people and cis women and marginalized genders is the term we use in the book. And so from that perspective, like what we're positing there and what I'm kind of trying to posit in this collection as well is that there's no way to fight for animal liberation while not fighting for these other causes and vice versa, because all the logics and the systems that uphold them are building off of one another.
I see. So let me return to race because it came up again in that answer, and I think this has got to be central to this conversation. I know that a lot of your critique is of white veganism. As I was reading your introduction, I noticed you said the problem of the animal advocacy movement is a problem of white organizations. So what's going on here? What is white veganism and what are these white problems that you're identifying?
So white veganism is sort of the term that's been used to understand our, especially in the US, our animal welfare movement, because it centers white interests and what white interests think the animal liberation movement should be, works within white institutions that have funding and works with white funders in their interests. And part of that is because, and I've done a lot of research in social movement studies. I focused on the suffragette movement. I focused on the LGBT movement. And really the answer always goes back to these movements end up prioritizing whiteness and centering white voices because that's the best and easiest way to assimilate into the state. So they actually weaponize the race relations in the United States and enact white supremacy in order to mobilize and create and acclimate and accumulate resources for their groups while marginalizing and oppressing the most marginalized folks in the movement. And so an example of that in the suffragette movement is that white suffragettes realized that to solidify their ability, white women, the ability to vote, they would have to organize and assimilate into the white supremacist state. And so there's discourse that if we are given the right to vote, we'll vote the same way as our husbands, and we'll make sure that we keep race relations the way they are. And at the same time that there was all this lynch law happening in the United States, right? Same thing in the LGBT movement. I did my thesis on this group called the Black Pride 4, which were trans and queer people of color in Cleveland who stopped a pride parade in 2017 to have a moment of silence for murdered Black trans women. And they were met with, they're mostly in a majority white space, and they were met with police violence. And Stonewall Columbus Pride, which is the white organization there that was the one behind the pride parade, worked with the police to remove them and then also prosecute them. And so that's another example of whiteness trumping, the movement. And that's because you can accumulate more resources and assimilate. But the folks who don't have the option to assimilate, like Black and trans people of color, have never had that opportunity, right? And so the same thing with white vegans. The people doing the most transformative work have not been centered in this movement and not been giving a platform, not been giving funds. And it's not like the work that we're doing now or the sort of this woke discourse that's happening in the AR movement, which is really exciting. But after 2020, these organizations started thinking through DEIJ, but really didn't follow through with their goals. When I was saying they were trying to think whether or not only what they should say about the Black Lives Matter movement, but whether they should say anything at all. That was also led in tandem with recognizing the issues with their internal and organizational structures within the organizations, which ended up being a really difficult place for people of color, especially Black people, to work. Right. And so AR has always had this diversity problem, but the way they go about it is saying, why aren't there more Black people? Do they not just care about our message? Instead of thinking through what is wrong with their organizations and our message that's weaponizing the state against people of color. And so that's sort of the argument that this book was really created to make, was to talk to these organizers and try to say, hey, this is what the issue is, and this is what we think you can do about it.
So, I mean, as you're answering that question, I can hear that a lot of this is coming from your personal experience and your close engagement with the animal activist movement or movements and animal activist organizations. And a lot of the contributions in the book are, in fact, coming from activists rather than from academics in the traditional sense. So, a lot of the critique that you're offering here is towards these animal activist organizations, whether they're vegan organizations or animal welfare organizations, for reinforcing these carceral logics, these white supremacist logics. So, could you think of an example or a few examples, perhaps, of organizations that are doing it right?
A food empowerment project, Lauren Ornelas' organization, is the one you think of right away. But they've had issues with funding, right? Because and then Lauren has felt so alienated from the vegan space that she has sort of removed herself from it in a lot of ways and thinks of herself more as like a farm worker rights organization because she's been alienated and abused in this vegan space. But she also fights for and recognizes that speciesism is entangled with these other civil and human rights issues. For internal cultures, I work with Sentient Media, which is this publication that focuses on getting more animal stories in news as a whole, then also offers a platform for some really cool research and work themselves, and also has a writers collective. And they've been really supportive of my work and work from other sort of marginalized animal scholars. And so I've drafted content for them on collaborative advocacy, on labor rights, and they have a lot of interest in actual equity and justice work for their organization. But other than those two groups, it's difficult because once you start trying to say that there's an issue with what has been funded, you don't get funding, right? And so that's one of the reasons why organizations have relied on carceral logics, is because it helps with fundraising. Because carceral logics in the United States, in a lot of ways, are very accepted and not challenged. And so when ALDF sells products that say herd an animal, go to jail, it sells. And it gets individual donors to fund that. And so these organizations follow the money without being critical of why, and don't think about whether or not their communication strategy and their campaigns have an actual, no matter what their intent is, has a negative impact, especially on marginalized populations. And that's something these organizations have started to question and think through. But in doing so, there's also been a lot of internal issues with management not wanting to change things. And that's leading to more conversations and labor issues and strife within these nonprofit spaces as well.
I see. And I mean, this is probably too big a question, but what kind of alternative funding models could there be?
I mean, you would hope that there'd be sort of like focusing on mutual aid, that people would want to put in a certain amount of dues to fund that. You know, you're hoping that these larger funders, when they're offering grants, are really invested in actually changing the world for the better instead of actually just making it seem like a PR thing, right? And you see that a little bit, especially with organizations and personal funders who are interested in climate change. And so there's a lot of environmental funders who've been funding the ALDF to build their environmental cases. And a lot of these cases are very coalition based and very exciting in a lot of ways. So ALDF has worked on cases in North Carolina with local community groups and meatpacking workers that have recognized the environmental degradation caused by mostly pig farming, right? And so that is something where there's a really cool coalition base and there's funding for those projects. But there, from what I can tell, and it's just changing a little bit, there's more money to go into DEIJ issues. But even with that, it ends up being sort of assimilating the critique instead of actually working on transformative internal or external change. And so you'd hope, as funders recognize that we are at the end of the Anthropocene. You know, the oceans are literally on fire. We have to be thinking through something more than a band-aid on capitalism. We can't work within the capitalist system to solve these issues of speciesism, to solve these issues of environmental degradation, that we actually have to target the system as a whole, which includes the state apparatus.
We've talked in quite general terms about the liberation perspective, I use this word quite loosely because I recognize there are issues here, but the intersectional perspective that we might be taking to pursue abolition. But I think it might be nice to delve into a couple of the chapters in detail. So there's a wide range of contributors here, several of them academics from various disciplines, including people we've spoken to on Knowing Animals before, people like Ilan Abrel, Vasile Stănescu. But there's also people who come from a more activist background who are not academics in the traditional sense. So, what kind of things are looked at in the book? Which particular chapters stick with you when you're thinking about the book?
So some of my favorite chapters are Kanika Sud's chapter, which is proposing an anti-carceral veganism perspective from India. And she was in my queer and trans voices, and Sanctuary Publishers and Julia have always really focused on bringing in voices that otherwise would not have access to publishing and not have a platform. And so Kanika is one of the people I've worked with on previous projects who really comes from this activist perspective. And they also do, sociology work, but really for a lot of the contributors in this collection, they go into academia or the research interests as a way to better understand how power operates and how to actually fight for more transformative change. And I think that's what's very different about this book than other books that really invite academics who have to, publish or perish in order to make their careers move forward. But Kanika's chapter really brings in her own experience as a queer person in India, and this is not a story that we hear very often, right? We just don't hear a lot of voices doing work like that. But really thinking through what an anti-carceral veganism could look like specifically in India and in Mumbai. One of my friends, Riley Valentine, they are finishing up their PhD in political science and really focusing on philosophy, and they are a medic and we're part of these uprisings. And actually in 2020, we're part of the protests offering like healthcare, direct action at healthcare. And they think through what they consider care ethics, how veganism may have been a bad care ethic and how to make it a good care ethic, which is a really interesting and helpful and impactful chapter. And then we also have a chapter by Miko Brown, who works with Farm Sanctuary. And Miko is just one of the best human beings. And they really think through sanctuary care and specifically as, a queer person of color, what the vegan movement needs to be doing to create actual transformative change.
In what ways do you think queer people approach animal studies differently?
So something interesting about this collection, and I think it partially has to do with my editing style and the communities. So when I think through my editing projects, I think of it as my form of advocacy and activism. It's bringing people into network and community and conversation with each other and creating ways of imagining worlds of possibilities together, right? So in a lot of ways, it's not just getting chapters together and publishing it and moving on. I'm trying to create a space for us to create together, and it's in a space where many of us have not been able to have our voices. And so partially as a trans person being able to create that, I think I'm looking at something different and inviting people who haven't been invited in the same way. Because in our collection, there's at least 4 trans people, out of 16 or so chapters. And I would say probably the majority of voices would identify as LGBTQIA. And that's very different than in a lot of spaces, right? And so when we're thinking of, who is centered in a collection and who isn't, you don't, when you're reading other academic collections, you may not think about how every voice in that is cis, right? Or cisgender. And that's just the voices you're used to hearing. So you wouldn't notice the absence of queer and trans voices. And so in this book, it's really trying to bring in these folks. And because we never really had an opportunity not to have our own identities politicized, and we never had an opportunity to not think how power operates, right? We were just never afforded that convenience. We obviously come into these questions differently than someone who might be cisgender or heterosexual does, because they've been afforded that convenience of not having to think through how oppression and power works and how the state operates to harm and police you. And queer and trans people are represented in prison populations more than they should be, right? Because the carceral state was built up in tandem as a way to police gender norms. And there's some really great books by like C. Riley Stanton, and Hugh Ryan just did this great book. He's a historian, and he really thinks through the way that gender nonconformity was policed and people were prosecuted for going outside of those norms. And so when we are writing about carceral veganism as trans and queer people, whether or not we mention that history, that's a history that lives with us and affects our positionality and our way of writing.
Before we move on to our quick questions, I wanted to ask you a little bit about RARA, Rights for Animal Rights Activists. So when I read about this project, this group, this organisation, it immediately made me think of Kendra Coulter, who was the first person I interviewed for Knowing Animals, and the work she does on humane jobs. So why do you think an organisation like RARA is needed?
The animal welfare movement, more so than other nonprofit spaces or other workspaces I've been in, is more exploitative towards their workers. And so not only is that an issue of salaries, and pay, which is getting slightly better, as the the labor movement as a whole in the United States is able to fight for larger salary floors, right? Higher salary floors. But in addition to the issues of like health benefits or free and exploited labor, or not having the right amount of, not having a living wage, the animal welfare movement has also had very deep, unhealthy work cultures around sexual harassment specifically. And you saw that with the Me Too AR movement, in 2018 at HSUS and other organizations. They also have recently been very anti-union as workers have wanted to unionize. You've seen this at Food and Water Watch. You've seen this at ALDF. And these organizations have actually worked with anti-union law firms to be able to try to bust their unions. And then there's also, like we were mentioning, a really big issue in these organizations with diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically being very hostile work environments for Black and Brown vegans in these spaces. And so Rahrah emerged out of ex-employees of the Save movement who had all had a very terrible experience there, in an internationally bad experience. We have activists from South America, from Turkey, from the UK, and they had this really, really bad experience together. And they were like, these are the issues we see. Let's make something good out of it. And so they were very interested in transparency and accountability. And so we are just about to launch, and our first campaign is really to be able to have and empower activists to feel safe enough to sort of do this rating system of the cultures of their organizations, and then hopefully work with management to try to figure out ways to build healthier work cultures. And so we've been working with animal charity evaluators, and we've used parts of their surveys that they use when they do audits and consultations, and then built that into our survey space. We're also hoping to be able to really facilitate and advocate for workers when they have something terrible happen to them, whether that is being in a situation where they were sexually harassed or assaulted while working or in these spaces, whether they've noticed a pattern of sex, gender, and race discrimination in hiring practices or in who is being promoted that they think could lead to litigation, whether they have faced so much verbal abuse that they'd like to go and think through what resources they have to try to change their organization, change management structures, change the governance and the board. And so in addition to having these resources, we also want to be able to connect these workers who may be acting as whistleblowers with other organizations that can advocate for them. If they want to talk to a law firm, to think through what law firms they might be able to reach out to. If they want to talk to the media, go through that, thinking through what resources they have available, if they've had patterns of unfair labor practices put against them, whether they can talk to the NLRB, whether they can talk to another American agency. And I'm coming from a US perspective, but the other people in my organization are from across the world. And this is not just a US issue or a global North issue, it's an international issue for workers.
Zane, we ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So I come from a very different space. I grew up in Appalachia, so people think that when Appalachia is sort of seen as like this culturally deviant space, right? Kind of like a hillbilly, like uneducated space in the American culture. And so people are always surprised when I say that I was raised by like ecofeminists. And so I grew up on the work of like Carol Adams, Alice Walker, Val Plumwood, Greta Gard. My mom was the first gender studies major at WVU and was a vegetarian feminist in the 90s before I was born. So I was raised with sort of these tenets of care ethics and feminist care ethics, which really probably has empowered the work that I do now.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So I've done a few freelance pieces and essays, but the first academic piece, my friend and I, Rebecca Eli is this autistic scholar who is also in my other collections on queerness in Appalachia and queer theory. But we did this piece for Anthony Nicella's new book, and I think it's called Vegans on Speciesism and Ableism, Equability Voices for Disability and Animal Justice. And our chapter is called Queering the Animate Body, Toxicity, Ecoability, and Multi-Species Solidarity in Duplin County, North Carolina. And in that chapter, we work with scholars like Eli Clare and Kate Sandilands and Mel Chen to think through how the toxicity caused by factory farming queers geographic regions, specifically in North Carolina. And so that just came out now, even though I worked on it a few years ago. So I guess technically that's the first piece we've written.
So if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Julia Feliz. Julia Feliz was the first person I read who really thought through consistent anti-oppression and really vocalized what I couldn't figure out how to vocalize with how systems and structures of oppression were intersecting. And so Julia's had a really big impact on my work.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So I think I kind of mentioned this earlier, but academics really should be thinking through their disciplines and the work they do as a way of using theory to inform praxis all the time, right? Like this is something I noticed when I was doing my MA in political science, is that a lot of political scientists might have been writing about the most terrible things in the world, just like genocide and all this violence, and they had no actual interest in solving it. They thought it was interesting to study. There's a lot of activists are very skeptical of academics as being exploitative and not really caring about their worlds. And I think there's a lot of anti-intellectualism in advocate spaces. And I find that problematic because there are some wonderful theorists and poets, who wouldn't consider themselves theorists, who inform the way I see the world and walk through the world and the sort of advocacy I attempt to do from these spaces. And so not only I think should academics really be focusing on their communities and the impact of their work and thinking through the best theories and genealogies of writers that they could use to think through these issues, but then also activists should, if they want to, engage with some of this theory to better the work that they're doing and better understand the worlds they live in.
Yes, this is a conversation that comes up again and again on Knowing Animals. And of course, as many listeners will know, we have this tension between critical animal studies and what we might just call animal studies about the relationship to activism. And I waver on this. I struggle with these questions myself. And I think one thing that comes to my mind, and by the way, I'm glad you mentioned the anti-intellectualism that we sometimes encounter. I've seen that in the vegan movement in a big way and among ordinary but quite vocal vegans sometimes, a real animosity towards universities and scholarship. One thing I'm struck by is the fact that sometimes, quite legitimately, academics work on very narrow, small questions because those narrow, small questions will take quite a lot of work to solve. And then there's a challenge, right? Because a narrow, small question is not going to be that useful sometimes. Sometimes it will, but often it won't be particularly useful for activists. And so activists see the work being done in these narrow, small questions and think, well, what's the value here? And I don't have an answer here, but I'm struck by a tension between what I think, and maybe you disagree with me here, but what I think is a legitimate academic goal, which is sometimes dealing with quite small, narrow, even obscure questions, and the understandable frustration that activists can have and say, well, help us with the problems we're actually facing here.
So at least with my experience, and academia is just a really difficult space to be in, and has its own labor issues and funding issues, right? And so, like my friend William Horn, who's in this chapter, and Riley Clare as well, both of their work really focuses on austerity in academia, right? And so there's a lot of really amazing work that's happening from activist academics who actually are like unionizing their workplaces, and the academia is a place of work, and it's been sort of ignored as that, especially in the US, because there's a really big issue of austerity in academia in the US. I didn't go into academia because I felt very strained by having to focus on these small questions, right?
Yes.
Without seeing the direct impact. And at some point, when I was thinking through the audience of my work, I didn't know if academia was the best way to create change. And I ended up being, outside of academia because of that. So that's something very personal to me that I decided. But I think there are some really wonderful critical animal studies scholars who work in academia, and especially in community colleges, who are doing work that is really important to the discipline, and these questions, as well as using it to inform their own advocacy. And again, I think that goes back to who's able to not have their bodies and their voices exploited, and who is able to not have their bodies and voices be politicized, and who has, right? So like the people I know who are activist scholars, who may not even want to be dubbed activist scholars, but they automatically are because they're queer and trans.
Yes.
Right. Or because of they face other axes of marginalization. And so they end up being pushed into that space. And so the folks who have the sort of privilege not to be activist scholars are those who haven't been politicized. So I think it's very complicated the way those kind of powers and issues of power interact.
I agree. And I'm certainly not going to say that the experience here is the same for vegan scholars as it is for, say, trans scholars or scholars of colour. But I think there's an interesting phenomenon that happens where people find out that I work on veganism, and I'm talking here about my academic colleagues.
Mm-hmm.
They find out that I work on veganism, that I am a vegan, that I'm writing in defence of animal rights, and they assume that I'm coming from an activist background. So they'll often say things like, oh, have you always been vegan? As if I was a vegan who then decided to study philosophy in order to pursue vegan ends, right? And actually, that maybe is the sort of direction you were coming from in the way you were describing your own trajectory. I personally come from the opposite direction. So I often say, well, look, I'm a vegan because I work on these issues. I've sat down, I've done the work, and that has led me to that conclusion. And so, if you like, I'm okay with being called an activist academic, but I'm kind of a reluctant activist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an activist because I'm an academic. And so I think you and I might have approached this from opposite directions. That might speak to some of our differences in terms of understanding the relationship here.
No, and it's because I think the main divergence there then is that whether there can be any actual, if people believe that there can be any actual neutral study or understanding of truth, right? And so I come from like a very like Foucauldian perspective and social constructivist perspective, where I don't believe there's any actual that there's no actual objective truth, right? And that the work that anyone produces can not, like, I don't believe that the work anyone produces can be completely outside of politics, right? That everything that I write or anything anyone writes has to do more with their positionality. And that's probably because I was an intellectual historian. And so I was very invested in this idea that when you're reading people's accounts of history, they could be all talking about the same instance in history, right? But they're doing it from different times. And so the way they construct and frame that says more about them and their period than the actual place they're writing from. And so that's sort of the space I come from. But if you're of the belief that there is an absolute moderate neutrality and just ability to study in a very positivist and neutralized way, then the idea of being called an activist scholar doesn't make sense, because then you're studying truth and trying to understand, especially from like a moral philosophy perspective, these constructions of truth.
Gosh, well, I feel I'd like to talk about this for an hour now, but let me instead let's ask you the fifth quick question, which is, if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about also, right? Is that you were saying you were studying the like human and animal constructs and the moral authority of that, right? And for me, I would say that power and speciesism informs our relations. And so if I had to change one thing, it would be so integrant. Like the idea that we are able to commodify or exploit animals, I believe, is based on that we see them as part of, as an object within the capitalist system, right? And similarly, that the way we understand and frame animals is the way we've understood and framed other marginalized people like queer and trans people. Or there's a lot of really interesting work on whether Black people have been constructed as the other, and as how animality has been weaponized against people of color, right? And so when we're thinking of human animal relations and relations to each other, I would say they can't be disconnected from power. That speciesism is inherently entangled in these kind of power issues.
Spoken like a true Foucauldian.
I love Daddy Foucault.
So what are you working on next?
So I have a few different projects. That I have two books that I've been working on since like 2018. At the same time, I finished them before I even worked on this book. But they're going through a peer review right now in academic presses, right? So it's going to probably be out in like 2 years. One is on sort of those queer ecologies of Appalachia. Because when I first read into Kate Sandilands, I was so invested in this idea of queering space and queer ecologies. And so I brought it back to my own home, thinking through Appalachia as an extraction zone. And so that book is another anthology that invites mostly queer voices to think through how Appalachia as a physical and geographic and cultural space has been queered. I find that really interesting. I'm kind of moving away from those questions now as I go into law school, but it's something I was really invested in 2018. And then this is very different. Well, it's not different for me, but it's also very different. I've always been really interested in socially engaged art and queer politics. And so again, like how power is embodied within ourselves, and if people are in protest in physical spaces, like how that just kind of, I don't know, disrupts normative power. And so I have a collection with Routledge right now, with Martin Zabraki, who's in the UK, on these questions of queer politics and thinking through engaged art and moving away from object-based art into creating an aesthetic of bodies and protest in space. So really these kind of critical geographies questions that I've been really invested in. So those are things I was really interested in 2018 that are still going through peer review and will be out in probably 2 or 3 years. But then I also have 2 other books that I'm working on that are more focused on what I'm really interested in now. One is this collection on labor and really thinking through human and non-human labor in the vegan movement, which is kind of these questions that Rahrah is thinking through. And it includes mostly activists interested in slaughterhouse workers, interested in nonprofit workers, interested in food service workers, and non-human animal labor, and bringing those people into conversation with each other to think through what a labor upheaval in these spaces could look like, and kind of moving away from the way we understand and construct labor under capitalism, neoliberal capitalism right now. And then I'm hoping to do this book during law school. It should be my first not edited collection that I'd publish, sort of a handbook on if you are a nonprofit worker, specifically an animal welfare profit worker, and X happens to you, what can you do? What relief's available for you? And these are the questions that we really are invested in Rahrah, and why I'm going to law school, is to understand, hey, what protections do you have if you face gender and sexual discrimination? What protections do you have if you're hit with a SLAPP lawsuit? What avenues can you go to? If you are forced to sign an NDA at work, what can you do to find relief? If you are faced with union busting techniques, how can you work with the NLRB or union organizers to try to find relief for that as well? And building a sort of a full handbook that could be very tangible for activists in these spaces.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Sure. So I'm on pretty much all social media. You can find my Twitter, Zane Crit Theory. You can follow me there. I'm also had this zine on Instagram forever ago called Marks in the Mountains. So you can find me in Marks in the Mountains if you're interested in DIY zine punk cultures. And then you can also reach me at rootsdiconsultingandpolicy@gmail.com.
Well, thanks, Zane, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram, and at the moment I'm posting lots of pictures of flowers at A Vegan Philosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.